we'll move on now to our next session, which is getting to net zero in Canada with pellets. So Canada has joined over 120 countries in committing to be net zero emission by 2050. A number of provinces and cities have already made similar commitments, and despite these progressive initiatives, there remain challenges and opportunities for biomass in Canada. And to discuss this, we're joined by one of the most passionate and enthusiastic advocates for the pellet and bioenergy sectors. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Jamie Stephen of Torchlight Bioresources. Jamie, take it away.
Thanks, Gord. Yeah, I guess nobody could say I'm not passionate about this space. So I will. So today I'm going to be speaking about reaching net zero and really why wood pellets are essential to do that. So there's a number of reasons, but really, you know, in the name of the cutest pet contest, this is my my business associate, or should I say pet. But I put this picture because it sometimes reminds me of how I feel talking about bioenergy policy in Canada. Sometimes you just want to stick your head in the covers and hope for the best and just say, oh, maybe another day. So to kind of summarize what I'm going to present today, really it comes down to a kind of logical pathway of ideas. Basically, if you don't have bioenergy, and I would put pellets as a key part of that, obviously, it means you can't have enhanced forest management in Canada and more active forest management, and you also can't have bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. Really the leading permanent negative emissions technology approach. If you don't have that, there is literally no way to achieve Canada's climate goals and climate commitments. So to keep that in mind, no bioenergy, no climate goals. So just some facts just to kind of ground us as to where we are. So Canada's 2019 anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions were about 730 megatons. That's exactly the same as they were in 2000 or 2006. We've basically gone nowhere over the past 20 years. That works out about 20 tons per person. And to put this in context, Sweden, which has a higher GDP per capita than we are, also a northern developed country, has 0.9 tons per person. So we are 22 times higher than the average Swede. Canada, as we know, is committed to a 40 to 45% reduction by 2030. And to put these numbers in perspective, we're talking in the range of over 300 million tons CO2 equivalent. This is the same as eliminating all fossil fuel stationary combustion in Canada by 2030, within the next nine years or so, or 8 years. And to compare this to other countries, Spain's total emissions, so this is a country of 47 million people, are 275 million tons. If you want to specifically focus on northern countries, the Nordics total is about 150 million tons. So we would have to eliminate twice as many emissions as all the current emissions of the Nordic countries. At the same time, Canada's forests have shifted from a net sink of greenhouse gas emissions to a net source. That means they're now an emitter. We don't record this within our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So for the most part, except on the active forest operations component. But they've gone from, on average, in the 1991 to 2001 period of absorbing 24 million tons per year on average, to a net emitter of almost 120 million tons, excuse me, that's a typo, million tons CO2 equivalent over the past 10 years. So that's a huge change. At the same time, it's important to recognize that the annual turnover of carbon of Canada's forests is about 5 times our anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So what that means is that small changes in the annual turnover of our forests can have very large impacts on a greenhouse gas basis. This is a graph showing Canada's the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada's managed forests since 1991. As you can see, the trend is not our friend. Now, this is a subcomponent of this. This is the forest management activities. And as you can see, this subcomponent of that overall forest emissions has been rising. And so this often begs the question, well, if we significantly reduce timber harvest, can we reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the forest sector? And so there's 2 points here that I'll show. Basically, this is not going to be the case. The first is what is really driving the greenhouse gas emissions is not forest management, but other disturbance. So this is wildfires and insects, pests, etc. So that's the red component there. And as you can see, that's a much larger contributor. The other aspect is our timber harvest has actually been going down. And so as greenhouse gas emissions are going up, timber harvest goes down. So these are basically, these are negatively correlated in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from the forest. So what it means is even completely eliminating timber harvest would not have a significantly beneficial effect to our greenhouse gas performance from the forest. Maybe in the short term, maybe in the next 5 years, but after that, it's not going to. Also, as we talk about the trends, these are some graphs from Natural Resources Canada. The number of large fires in Canada, if we continue on our emissions pathway, is projected to be 4 to 8 times what it is currently, or in the 1981 to 2010 period. Obviously varies from place to place in country, but overall a dramatic increase in the number of large wildfires. And then when you look at the annual area burned, which is a greater indicator of the actual carbon emissions coming off the forest, what you can see is under certain projections, a tripling or potentially even quadrupling of the total area burned by 2100. What this really means now is some key things. If Canada meets its climate commitments, so that 40 to 45% reduction by 2030, I'm a little hesitant to say that we will, given the current direction. But if we do meet those climate commitments, forest greenhouse gas emissions will exceed anthropogenic emissions by 2035. That will mean Canada's forests are more important to the climate budget, if you will, than anything we emit as humans. By 2050, Canada's forest greenhouse gas emissions will be equal to approximately 60% of our current anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So that means that we won't be meeting net zero. We won't be meeting any of these climate goals because we will have not addressed what is a primary climate risk. Those 2050 emissions will also be roughly equal to the UK's current emissions. So even if the UK did meet net zero by 2050, Canada's forest emissions would essentially compensate that from an atmospheric perspective. And these numbers don't even include black carbon, which is a short-lived climate forcing agent or climate pollutant, as ECCC calls it, which in a 100-year basis it increases represents kind of 100 to 200 megatons CO2 equivalent. But in a 20-year basis, which is kind of the more immediate warming, is really could be even larger than the greenhouse gas component, rather than the CO2 emissions that are emitted. So under this, the net forest greenhouse gas emissions, right where we're at is that the carbon turnover is so large, even though that's relative to what we produce as humans. The carbon turnover of the forest is so large that what it means is any changes in that turnover can have a very large absolute impact within the overall inventory. But the key thing here is risk versus opportunity, and it really depends on what we do. So what can we do? So number one, we have to focus on climate smart forestry. And there's a number of components to this. The first is enhancing active forest management. Really trying to store as much carbon as possible in solid wood products. Obviously, the active forest management is also about storing as much carbon as possible in the forest. And then the utilization of all the residues, everything that cannot become solid wood products, in the form of utilizing that in the form of bioheat, in some cases bioelectricity, and then storing that carbon underground using bioenergy carbon capture and storage. So let's start with active forest management. Fundamentally, Canada must take responsibility for its forests. I think this really is an issue of the credibility of Canada's climate strategy, but it also comes down to actual climate performance. What's the point of going through this huge process of trying to decarbonize our economy and all the challenges and pain that is going to cause if we're not even going to address this giant source of greenhouse gas emissions that is our forest? Active forest management means more harvest, not less. It doesn't mean clear cutting and removing whatever we decide. It means making decisions based upon how is this going to impact the climate performance of the overall system. And the overall system includes not only what's in the forest, but also how we're storing the carbon that has been removed by the forest. And again, this is a macro climate performance. It's not on an individual acre by acre basis. This is where carbon debt often comes up. And carbon debt is largely an issue that is a misunderstanding on the scale at which we manage forests. We have to reduce wildfire and reduce insect infestation risk. And when there is an event, to quickly address it. This means much more frequency of treatments. And it does mean a big change in terms of how we approach forestry in Canada. It will generate, the key thing here is if we do this active forest management, it will generate a very large volume of very low grade wood fiber material. And it will be high cost fiber relative to the traditional forestry sector. But this is the key point. It's low cost on a carbon basis. And so we've already heard today, let's emphasize high value bioproducts. The challenge is, and what people don't recognize, that is if you price carbon, bioheat, bioelectricity is a high value use of wood products. It is a high value bioproduct. As an example, if we're at $170 a ton for carbon, then the value of that in simple carbon terms and not even on energy terms is about $175 a cubic meter. So I just wanted to bring this up in terms of this idea of active forest management and what is possible. So the net carbon uptake of Sweden's forests reduces their national greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. So every year they're adding more and more and more carbon to the standing timber. And yet at the same time, more is being sequestered in long-lived solid wood products, and bioenergy represents about 37% of Sweden's energy uptake or energy consumption. So this is a viable strategy. So people say, okay, well, going into the boreal forest and doing improvement cuts and thinnings, etc., is just not economical in Canada. So this is to my point on carbon at $170 a ton. Basically what that does, and if you're looking at compared to bioheat, it increases the price of natural gas on a life cycle basis by $10.50 a gigajoule. If we consider the climate impact on a 20-year basis, is actually even higher. So adding that to the current delivered residential price for natural gas in Canada, we end up around $20 to $32 a gigajoule. Wood fuel price equivalent is about $360 to $575 per ton of pellets, or $200 to $320 per cubic meter of fiber. I don't think there's many foresters out there who could say, oh, well, we can't get fiber there for less than $320 a cubic meter. This doesn't even consider the avoided black carbon emissions or the benefits of reduced wildfire risks, such as human health and air quality. Now people say, okay, well, yeah, that's, we're projected to do this, we'll see what happens with the election today, but 170 by 2030, but we're not really going to get there. But the reality is today we already have climate policies and programs that are pricing carbon at around $250 per ton CO2 equivalent. So an example of that is FortisBC's renewable natural gas purchase program. That's 200, all those RNG purchase contracts are in the range of $200 to $250 a ton CO2 equivalent when you compare the value of natural gas or price of natural gas to RNG. And then also the low carbon fuel standards that we see in California and BC, they are also around $250 a ton CO2 equivalent. And so when you add that to the price, to the residential price of natural gas, you're looking at a wood fuel equivalent price of up to $670 per ton of wood pellets, or $370 a cubic meter for wood fiber. So going back to the next strategy is really store that carbon, as much carbon as possible. We should all take pride in whenever we see solid wood products, long-lived solid wood products, that 50% of that is carbon, and we are storing it for the long term. And we need to use more and more and more of this, because obviously, if we're harvesting timber, once that timber has been harvested, we're regrowing in the same location, and that even if the carbon is still stored in that house, in that chair, in that wood flooring, there's now, 50, 60 years later, there's now a new tree in the exact same site, but the carbon continues to be stored. Now, the key thing though, and I hear a lot about, oh, well, we'll do cross-laminated timber, we'll do glulam, we'll do all these mass timber products. I've had conversations with developers who say, oh, we are all in on mass timber, but don't tell me about bioenergy because that's not sustainable. Well, the reality is not all wood can become solid wood products. The quality, the type of material, etc., it is often just not there. So historically, our forest sector has been built upon two main pillars. One is lumber, solid wood products, and the second is pulp. But as you can see, and as you can probably have guessed, pulp has not been a great sector to be in over the past 30 years. So this is pulp, both chemical and mechanical pulp, newsprint and printing and writing papers. What you can see is that we've had dramatic reductions in production in Canada since 1991, ranging from a reduction of over 1/3 for chemical pulp to almost 80% reduction in production for newsprint. Right? This has resulted in a fundamental change and is the primary driver for that reduction in timber harvest within Canada. But this has significant impacts upon how we manage forests, because this is where all the mill residues went, but it also where all that low quality, undesirable, if you will, material went that wasn't worthy or marketable for sawmills. And then say, okay, well, where are we going to put all this material? People who talk about high value products don't recognize the difference in volume between pulp and pretty much every other product out there. The only thing that can potentially replace pulp is energy. And in terms of energy in Canada, approximately 60-65% of our energy demand is in the form of heat. Only about 12% of our energy demand actually requires electricity. And electricity represents only about 16% of our actual energy consumption in Canada. So the key thing here is we spend all this time talking about electricity, but it's all about heat. And this is the market that makes the most sense for biomass and obviously for pellets. So if you want to learn more about bioheat, there's a presentation on the Wood Pellets Association website, and is kind of specific to Atlantic Canada, but it includes a whole lot of information about bioheat. So I won't go through all these, but you can what you can know is that we can go from the individual residence scale, commercial institutional, to citywide district energy systems, to industrial heat. Now, the final component that I'm going to talk about today is bioenergy carbon capture and storage. And if we had started making significant climate action, climate investments 20 years ago, we probably wouldn't need BECCS, but we are where we are, and we've got, essentially, we're going to have 8 years to deliver on these Paris commitments of a 40% greenhouse gas reduction. And I see no way of doing that without negative emissions. This is where you're taking emissions from the atmosphere and permanently storing them underground. So in terms of a key thing about storing CO2 is that you have to have the geological formations to do it. And pretty much in Canada, that comes down to the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin. That's about 95% of our potential. And this means getting wood, in simple terms, to Alberta and Saskatchewan. This is one of the key reasons why pellets are absolutely essential, because a lot of the wood fiber available is in northern Saskatchewan, northern Manitoba, northern Ontario, northern Quebec, but they don't have the geology to be able to do BECCS. They also don't have the large existing infrastructure assets in terms of coal-fired power plants for the most part, and they also don't have the large thermal energy demands. So here is an idea for the government of Canada, whoever that is, come tomorrow, to reduce the emissions in Canada by 1 million, by 100 million tons. So this is a list of the coal-fired power plants in Canada. I've excluded one in Nova Scotia because it's already 65 years old. But right now, their combined emissions are about 43 million tons CO2 per year. If you substituted coal in these coal-fired power plants for wood pellets, and then stored that CO2 underground at a 90% capture rate, you would be about close to 60 million tons CO2 underground. And so the net overall greenhouse gas emission would be about 100 million tons, which would get us about a third of the way that we need to for the Paris climate commitments. So people will say, well, 100 million tons CO2 using switching over these assets to pellets, that's just impossible. Well, so number one, how much wood do we need? We would need approximately 70 million cubic meters would be required. Currently, and this doesn't include anything to do with harvest residues, it doesn't include non-merchantable timber, it doesn't include active forest management for wildfire risk. Right now, there's 60 million cubic meters available in the annual allowable cut within the supply. And the current harvest levels are about 50 million cubic meters below the 2004 harvest levels. So getting up to 70 is not completely out of the realm of possibility, particularly when you consider all the harvest residues that we're currently underutilizing based upon commercial forest operations. Capital costs for all retrofitting and adding BECCS to all these facilities would be about 40 to 50 billion dollars. This is just the BECCS component, but annualized capex of about 10 to 20 dollars per ton CO2. And if you look at the kind of value, if we're talking 170 dollars a ton CO2 equivalent, you're talking about 245 dollars a ton for wood pellets. So not out of the realm of possibility. We do need more human resources without a doubt, but 140,000 jobs have been lost in the forest sector since 2000. And a lot of, there's a significant opportunity here to create jobs for Indigenous communities, for Indigenous peoples, to lend towards reconciliation and to really lead that advancement of active forest management. I also want to put this 100 million tons in context. I think it's important to ask yourselves, is this a more difficult solution than eliminating every single ton of emissions from building heat in Canada and eliminating aviation and eliminating oil refining? Because that's really what we're talking about. That's the level of reduction that is required. Electricity is really just the start. As I mentioned, 65% of Canada's energy consumption is heat. And so most of that is in the form of natural gas. Canada has a very large number of thermal steam facilities, and a lot of them are actually located in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where we have the geology to be able to store the CO2. This includes things like oil sands, chemicals, pulp and paper, etc. And we are already seeing this in a number of European cities. Stephen Drayton from Drax is going to be speaking later about their ambitious BECCS goals of creating negative emissions. And then on the district energy side, Edmonton recently came out with a new climate plan and is Canada's first city to include a citywide district energy system within as a core part of its 2030, 2050 climate plan. Electricity, utilizing the existing coal-fired generation assets is a starting point, but really can also lead then down to addressing our primary energy market, which is heat. So in summary, Canada's largest climate liability, but also its opportunity, is its forests. We're 2% of the world's anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, but we have 9% of the world's forests, and ours will be more subject to changing climate than many other forests in the world. We really need a re-envisioning of forests and forest management in Canada with a primary focus on a climate smart forestry lens. That's not to say the other values, whether it's ecosystem services, biodiversity, those can be balanced and we can manage forests for multiple values. But we really do need this climate lens on our forests, or there's no way of meeting our climate targets. Bioenergy must be viewed as both a climate mitigation and adaptation necessity. And because pellets are able to be transported much more easily, utilize a variety of different inputs, they are an essential fuel to address meet these energy goals and to utilize our existing coal-fired generation assets. Finally, I truly believe this. I could be proven wrong in 8 years, but I really doubt it. Net zero will not be reached, or I guess Paris, or even net zero in 2050. Net zero will not be reached without large-scale BECCS and active forest management. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jamie. We are just about out of time, but I'm going to throw one question at you that came in here. Going back to your comments about the forest fires, this person's wondering, could the number of large wildfires also be caused by the age of the forest? And has that been factored into that 10 times larger impact than 1985?
So there's absolutely a number of factors. Obviously, fire is a natural component of our forest ecosystems in the boreal. But what I often argue is that in a changing climate, and we are in a changing climate, there are no kind of nothing is purely natural anymore. And so if you look at the Nordic countries, and obviously slightly different ecosystems, but they're doing much more active forest management than we are in Canada, and their wildfire levels are dramatically lower. And you even see this in California, for example. Like within their recent this year's wildfires, there were areas that had been actively managed for 20-30 years, and the wildfires essentially came up to that area and then pushed back because there was not enough low-grade fuel in lower levels. There was spacing between the trees. They were healthier trees. People forget trees need light and space to grow. And so if we want to store more carbon, we need larger trees. And in order to do that, you need to also thin out the forest and create that light and space. So there is an age component for sure, but there's also a spacing and an active management component to allow those trees to get larger and to but in doing so, you create a large volume of material that needs to be utilized.